being able to
All right. All right. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. It's nice that you could come out today for the Lunch and Learn. I'm just going to do a quick introduction and then tour. So, Greg has worked for MCC since 2007. He is currently MCC Ontario's Walking with People program coordinator. One part of the work has been to advocate for provincial policies and reduce poverty and social exclusion. Greg is the Ontario Living Wage Network. Greg lives in Kitchener with his wife Marlene and their 3 kids. He is quite active on the local music scene. You may stumble upon him busking at the market on Saturday morning, singing in the choir at St. Joseph's Catholic Church on Sunday on various porches in Kitchener downtown neighborhoods, which I did this summer. So, Greg is my boss, but I also consider him a friend. So with that, Greg DeGroot-Majetti, you're up.
Thanks, Katie, and thank you all for coming out to share lunch here, and happy Living Wage Week. This week, the first full week in November, is celebrated as Living Wage Week in Ontario, across Canada, and other parts of the world, and so that's part of the reason why I'm leading this Lunch and Listen today. So we're going to start off with a little video, but let me just say what I hope this half hour that we have together, and I hope to do it in enough time to leave time for some questions, but I want to look at what the living wage is, how it minimum wage, a brief look at the history of the modern living wage movement, look at how living wages are calculated, and then all what it means to become a living wage certified employer. But let's start first by hearing the voices of some workers who work for local living. Doesn't include anybody from Mennonite Central Committee Ontario. MCCO is a living wage employer as well. But if we've got the video ready, let's hear some of these voices.
being able to be a part of an agent now walks the walk and talks the talk is huge.
For me at the shelter, I was working as a relief staff, and there was quite a big raise when I think it went up by $3 an hour. So it was a very nice change, and I don't feel like I need to get another job.
For me, because we are modeling what we're preaching in the community, which is being able to belong and thrive, and it's really hard to do that when you're not being paid a living wage.
I'm now debt-free. I've been able to start putting money into a savings account so that I can save for anything that might happen in the future. Forever in my past jobs, I've always been thinking, okay, I need to make more, but now I'm really happy with the money that I'm making. I'm not even about it. It's not that bad.
if you want to get the best quality of work from the people that you're employing, then the best way to do that is to pay a living wage. And I think you'll see productivity go up, engagement, and loyalty, right? We're loyal because they don't have to think about putting food on the table, about making that electricity bill.
So I just come to work and I work with the guys, and I love this place. I love the people that I work with. And I think everyone on the whole is like really happy to be here.
I was skiing at Grouche when I was in school. Halfway through, I got switched over to living wage, which was really helpful because I still had a year of school left. I still had loans. I had a lot to pay for. So it was really nice to get the extra income. And it just showed that Grouche was caring about us. Good.
Habitat's mission is to help people break the cycle of poverty. So we're working with partner families in attain their dream of home ownership. It only made sense to us that that mission also extended to our employees.
Or paying the next debt off. It also means that my wife, who works with a youth shelter, doesn't have to pick up an
Reporting and sending a message to our employees that they were valued and that we wanted them to stay with us and grow with us as an organization.
Just to know that they care not only about the bottom dollar, they care about me and my family means a lot. It gives me that energy to come and wake up every morning, come to work so that I can go out and help others getting their goal of getting a new home.
I would make the argument that yes, moving to living wage is a business decision that businesses need to make, because I think you motivated, the more engaged employees you have, the better their help to you as a business is going to be.
So I think every company should. I mean, they work for you. I mean, they're making you the money. A little extra incentive to go that extra mile.
Great. So let's move on to talk about living wage and dig into it a little bit. So first, $18.52 an hour is much higher than it is, say, here in Waterloo Region, where currently it's $15.42 an hour. And you see it varying based on the costs in different communities. The other thing with the living wage is the idea is that if you're working for at the living wage rate, you should have enough not just to get above the poverty line, make ends meet, and be able to participate in community. And I'll talk a little bit about how we build in that participating in community in calculating the living wage rates. The other wage, as the living wage employer program is run in Ontario and other places, it's a voluntary program. We invite employers of all sorts, and you saw in the for-profits, a for-profit business, but we also have public sector employers like the City of Cambridge that have enrolled in the living wage program. And they do it voluntarily, and then by getting certified, we also celebrate those employers, and they can help show other employers how to go about implementing living wage. Main differences between the minimum wage and the living wage. So a brief walk through the history of the modern living wage movement. You know, the notion that if you're working full-time, full year, you should have enough to make ends meet and all that is a notion that's been around for a long time, but it was really only in the 1990s in the US when faith groups, anti-poverty groups, and unions noticed a real rise in bad jobs, low-paid jobs, and working and still living in poverty, that they began using the living wage as a way to try to improve jobs. And in the US in the 1990s, the municipalities to pass a living wage ordinance that said anybody doing business with the city had to pay their employees at least the living wage rate doing work for the city. And I think there was 140 or so municipalities across the US that implemented living wage. That was in the 1990s. In the 2000s in the United Kingdom, again, church groups, labor groups, anti-poverty groups are seeing the same rise in bad jobs, a lot of low-paid work. You know, people working as cleaners and things like that. So they also picked up this idea of the living wage. They took a slightly different approach, though. What they aimed at was to try to get employers of all sorts to implement living wage. And so they set up this living wage certification program for employers. And I think they just passed 3,500 or so employers that have signed on in the UK. And the movement, from my perspective, took off when they created that program. And they've got all the major banks in the UK. The government of Scotland is a living wage employer. They have small and large and municipalities, and it's a very big program, and it's really had a significant impact in the UK. With the UK compared to the US and Canada, though, is they made a strategic decision early on to just publish 2 living wage rates, one for the City of London, one for the rest of the UK. And it was a strategic because when they looked at the larger employers who they really wanted to get at, they realized that their HR resource structures usually were designed that they had a pay scale for the City of London where it's really expensive, and another pay scale for the rest of the UK in their program so that it could match up with those national employers. So in Canada, groups like Campaign 2000, the anti-child poverty group that's been around since the late 80s, they were beginning to see that there were a lot of with children living in poverty, but that had the equivalent of full-time work for one or at least one of the parents in the household, or combined work. And so communities in Canada began trying to see whether the living wage could be a useful tool to help reduce poverty. And the first attempts were to try to get municipalities to living wage ordinances. And I have to say that in the early days, that just didn't work in Canada. We didn't get any to sign on. But in BC, they launched a living wage program like the one in the UK and started signing on employers of all sorts. And then a municipality signed on, New Westminster, BC. And so the program really began to set down roots in Canada around that time. In about 2011, 12, 13, in Ontario, communities started to look at that model. So Hamilton was the first community in Ontario to living wage employers. And they were followed quickly by Waterloo Region, where MCC helped to convene a group of organizations to launch a program. That was launched in November 2014, right here in this room, actually. And then Windsor launched a program, and Wellington in 2015 also launched a program. And now there are over 30 communities in Ontario that are involved in the living wage movement. About 18 or so have actually done living wage calculations. And a significant evolution of the movement has been that rather than having a lot of separate local employer programs, in April of this year, they combined together, and now there's a single Ontario living wage employer program. So we're beginning to get employers from all across signing up for the living wage, to become living wage certified. Currently, we have over 160 employers signing in. And every week I see signing on. And again, that reflects, not-for-profits, for-profit businesses. We're getting some public sector employers also signing on the program. So there's your brief capsule summary history of the modern living wage movement. If there's a burning question, feel free to ask. I put together 20 slides for a 30-minute presentation, which gave me about 20 seconds per slide. And as you can see, I'm not getting there. So let me talk a little bit about how the living wage is calculated. So we don't just look at how much you would earn at the living wage rate. We also what the taxes you have to pay, but also the benefits that you would get. So it starts by actually looking at annual family expenses. And I'll talk about our reference household that we use to calculate living wage rate. What would be the expenses that you'd need to cover in a year? Make ends meet and participate in community. And then we figure out income from employment that you get. We deduct income from government transfers, so things like child benefits and things like that. And then deduct federal and provincial income tax payments and EI payments. So it's looking at after-tax and transfer income. What wage would you need to get paid when you take into account taxes and transfers to meet family expenses? So we have a nifty little tax and transfer calculator that we can use to just plug in the expenses, calculate, and in theory, it just kicks out the number, and it's quick and easy. It's a little more complicated than that. And it was the Canadian Alternatives that actually developed the tax and transfer calculator in Ontario and in BC too, where they use it. So just a word about the reference house. So we need to settle on what household type or types to use to figure out family expenses and things like that. So in Canada currently right now, the reference household that's used to do the calculations is a 4-person household with 2 adults and 2 young children, a 3-year-old girl and a 7-year-old boy. And as I said earlier, we use 37.5 hours as the equivalent of full-time. And the assumption for doing the calculation is that both parents are working full-time, full year. And so then the cost of childcare and things like that. In the early days when communities were doing the living wage calculations, they would do several different household types. So this household type, adult, maybe a single parent with 1 child. And what they were finding was that often those living wage rates between the 3 varied by 15 to 25 cents. So to kind of simplify the methodology, we settled on this reference household. And so currently that's what's used for this. What's included in the calculation. So again, the basics like shelter, food, transportation, clothing, and footwear. We build in non-OHIP health care, so prescription drugs, dental, and things like that. We assume that the household themselves has to purchase their own for that. Communications, whether that be a phone, cable. We built in a year for each of the adults, an adult education course. And the reason being that in Canada, for many low-paid workers, in our very important for workers to keep upgrading their skills so that they're able to match the needs in the economy. Many employ that kind of training, ongoing training for their staff, but it turns out that not for low-paid staff. Generally speaking, they don't get that training. So we build in that the household actually has themselves to take the extra courses at a community college to keep upgrading their skills. So that's factored in there. Childcare, as I mentioned, but also entertainment, a modest amount of, a vacation, going out once in a while with the family, to capture that sense of it's to meet basic needs and be able to participate in the life of the community as part of living wage. So that, in a nutshell, is the calculation and how it's done and what it's meant to cover. And move on to talking about becoming a living wage employer. So let me just stop there. Any burning questions about the calculation and how it's done?
So that would imply that the child tax benefit was increased.
Very interesting. Yes, for the living wage. In many, many communities it did. It did. And so what we're actually re-examining right now is whether our assumption that this reference household still holds as a valid assumption, or whether because child benefits and actually child care subsidy only impact certain household types, households with young children, right? So rate comes down like it did in Waterloo Region from $16.05 an hour in 2016 to $15.42 an hour because of that change in. Is that still really enough for a single adult to get by on? Now we did run some test calculations last year and it still seemed to be reasonable, but that's something that we're exploring right now. But that's an interesting feature of living wage. It captures public policy and pay. So if we get a pharmacare, national pharmacare program, it will make it easier for employers to pay a living wage rate can come down to reflect the fact that some of those things we're paying for together and that employers don't need to cover it and pay. Yeah, more questions? Go ahead. Why don't you go? Well, it's really, the list is simply a tool. And so not everybody works full-time full year. But we had to have some way to calculate wage rate and so that it comes in at a reasonable amount, both for a worker, but for employers paying that as well. So that's the kind of assumption that's used to make the calculation. But the idea is that full-time and part-time employees, the living wage rate's the same.
Living wage rate has parents in the home?
Yeah.
So what if there's a single family?
Again, the living wage rate is the same for any worker. And based on the calculations that had been done, that if you use that reference household, and assume both parents are working full-time, full year, and take into account benefits, it roughly is enough to cover expenses for different households, including, say, a single parent. But I really stress, it's not the answer to everything, and it doesn't necessarily work for all households. But the idea is to raise wages to a level that, helps more households to actually make ends meet. So it's not perfect. It's a tool. I'll just talk quickly about the Living Wage Employer Program. We've asked employers why they sign up to become a living wage employer, because it does often entail increasing costs. Number one reason employers say is it matches their values. And so they want to implement living wage. So on this little banner here, you can find there. And because I just want to walk through how the process and what it means for an employer to sign on. So as I said, in April, we launched this guide to becoming a living wage employer that applies Ontario right now. And it's very similar to the guide that's used in BC as well. In fact, we work closely with them. So there's two main criteria of living wage employer. And that is that all your direct employees, including full and part-time, are paid at or above the living wage rate. So those would be anybody who's on your direct employees. A lot of employers, though, contract out non-core work. So like cleaners and security staff, and in big organizations, mazes. So a living wage employer also has to commit to paying those contracted staff at or above the living wage rate when they're working at organization. So primarily it applies to positions like cleaners, like security. It could be IT support that you hire in. But that's the commitment that employers make. Now, one of the things that we do is we look at total compensation for figuring out whether an employer is paying a living wage. So as I said, in doing the calculation, we assume households have to buy their own health insurance. If an employer provides health benefits, we could provide an offset, figure out the hourly amount that's worth, and they have that plus, and then we can figure out what the hourly pay that has to be paid when you take into account benefits to equal the living wage rate. So could be like $1 an hour worth of health benefits, so that that would mean an employer would have to pay $14.42 an hour in addition to the benefits that are provided. So total compensation. I'm just going to click through these, and then we'll finish off with some more questions. We also take into account that employers can have up to 10% of their full-time equivalent staff in trainee positions or co-ops or practicums and paid below the living wage rate. And there's two ideas behind this. One is we don't want to foreclose opportunities for people training and experience. And the other is that training and experience has a value in itself. So here in saying that those positions need to be paid positions unless the student is in a course of study that says they have to do an internship, and it has to be unpaid. So for example, social work students have to do placements and they're not allowed to be paid according to the program. But otherwise, those positions should be paid, but they can be paid at below the living wage rate so long as it's less than 10% of the equivalent staff. We also have a phased implementation, recognizing that it can take a while for an employer to fully implement living wage. So at the support, employers can be recognized, certified at the supporter level, and that's when all their full-time direct staff are paid a living wage rate, and they submit a plan for how they're going to get their part-time staff and then their contracted staff to the living wage rate. When all full-time and part-time direct employees are at rate or above, then they can be recognized at the leader level, again, with a plan to get their contracted staff up to that point. And then when all direct and indirect employees are at the living wage rate, then they're certified at the champion level. So to give you an idea of the kind of phase-in process, when the city signed on as a living wage employer, all their full-time staff were already at the living wage rate. And so they looked at all the contract positions that they had and all the ones that were, and they said that their plan was over 2 years they were going to get those staff up to that point. And in year one, they bring people halfway up to the living wage rate, which was this year. And in year two, they'll bring the rest of the way to the living wage rate. And then the next step is then to look at their costs. So that's an idea of how that phased implementation works. And I mentioned before that MCC, we are a certified living wage employer. We helped in launching Living Wage Waterloo Region. I currently serve as the chair of the Ontario Living Wage Network. And that's a picture from when we launched Waterloo Region in 2014, and the first 10 employers that were certified in 2014. So we say, you know, living wage, it's good for people, it's good for business, and it's good for community. And we're thankful for support that we get from the Atkinson Foundation, for the network, Kindred Credit Union, which is part of our Leaders Circle, sponsoring their Living Wage Employer program, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, who's helping work, and MCC, who provides well, some of my time, and also our administrative host for the Ontario Living Wage Network. There you go, in a nutshell. So I'm happy to stick around. I know it's 12:33 and a half, so if you need to go, you can. I won't be offended. Happy to also take any kind of questions that you might have or suggestions.
Just one question would be, tradition, and I know they're not the same, okay, so, but when people look at minimum wage studies, they find that a very large proportion of those people would be third earners in a household, that is to say, teenagers with part-time jobs. This seems to just ignore that.
Well,
In a sense, I mean, like, by choosing that standard household, and then saying, well, if I'm going to be the city of Cambridge and employ teenage lifeguards, and I want to be certified, I have to meet that standard for my teenage lifeguards. Does that sound right?
yeah, actually, I mean, the challenge for them is they're not able to attract, lifeguards is actually a skilled occupation.
Maybe teenage lawn cutters in the summer, temporary workers or whatever.
So, yeah, I mean, the idea is that, right, to become a living wage employer, unless it's a position that's specifically designed for somebody who's in a program of study and designed to give them, you know, training or placement or whatever, business that has a job and it just happens to be performed by somebody who's 18 or 17 or whatever, to be a living wage employer, yeah, that position would have to be paid at the living wage rate. So the living wage clearly sets a higher standard, you know, and the reality is though, and it's actually some of the numbers around who's actually getting paid the minimum wage or below $15 an hour. It's actually people that are over 25 that are paid at that rate than you would think. There are as well. But from some of the employees who talked about how they had student debt and student expenses, you know, they still have to, unless you're, I mean, high school students presumably are, but would also be, you know, hoping to save for university or to move out or things like that. So it can still be a practical tool.
Have you, like in Australia, the minimum wage is associated with age. Did you look at that model at all?
But opted for it being based actually on the type of position rather than the age of the person. So that's why we have that for co-op placements and internships, so jobs that are designed to give somebody experience. So, great questions. I mean, these are all they've had to kind of grapple with as we've developed the program. So, anyway, thank you folks for coming out. Tomorrow evening, there's at the Waterloo Regional Museum is the Living Wage Waterloo Region's Living Wage Employer celebration event at 5 o'clock at Waterloo. And if this was really